So how many of you have heard of Keenan Lonsdale? I'll be honest, he isn't someone who I've ever really come across, although from what I can gather, he appeared in a film called Love, Simon a couple of years ago. That's not something that I've really watched or have any interest in watching. But what brought him to my attention is a Twitter thread that kind of went viral over the last week, where someone pointed out that Keenan Lonsdale prefers using tree and tree self pronouns. Now, this is apparently a real thing. There are a number of articles about Lonsdale written by the quote-unquote queer press who talked about Lonsdale admitting that he uses tree pronouns, and ultimately it's being framed in a way that this is something to be respected, that this is what his pronouns are, everybody should be basically getting on board. Now, this Twitter thread that I mentioned does also show a number of people in there who make an argument that Keenan's pronouns are valid and that this is something that really everyone should be respecting. And so that made me kind of think, and it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. What is it that actually makes these pronouns valid? Now, we are used to a lot of identities being made up over the last couple of years, and the insistence that we treat them with a level of integrity regardless of what they are. But we're never really given much of an answer as to exactly why this should be treated as valid outside of effectively people's feelings will be hurt. So this applies to gender identities and sexual identities, and I thought to kind of have a bit more of a look into it, let's take a look at something which is not considered valid. Now, the easiest example to bring up from over the last couple of weeks is that of super straight. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it, but for those who don't, it was an incredibly low effort trolling that was done through TikTok, but despite it being low effort, that was almost its beauty, because it really riled up a lot of trans and LGBT activists, which, let's be honest, it isn't a hard thing to do, but the fact that they flipped out over something with such a lame name kind of shows how easy it is to get on people's nerves. Now, the articles that I've seen written about super straight, or the people who have commented on it and disagree with it, very clearly do not treat this as a valid sexuality. And the reason for that is effectively coming down to, well, this sexuality revolves around excluding trans people from your dating pool. This is something which is inherently bigoted. And so the easiest way to kind of draw a line under that is that your identity isn't valid if it's simply based on an ideology. Ultimately, it shouldn't matter whether that ideology is bigoted or not. Ideology is kind of where that line is drawn. In order for any of this to make any kind of sense, you need to have a consistent line. Although we are more than aware that these people do not argue in good faith, and they certainly do not keep their consistency. They're certainly not consistent with their arguments. So whilst super straight itself is something which a lot of people have said aren't valid, I think it's therefore fair to kind of also have a look at something which is valid by these people. And for that, I'm going to go to have a look at a list of genders. When it comes to the list of genders, normally people will refer to the Tumblr super list, which has, I think it has a good few hundred different genders in it. Ones including like cosmic genders, moon genders, trigenders, buzzwords that ultimately I'm not 100% sure whether they're even treated seriously by the community, because these ones are incredibly obscure. Despite the argument that all genders are valid, these aren't ones that you're likely to see in a mainstream publication or activists pushing, probably because of how daft they sound. So let's have a look at one which is actually promoted by more mainstream outlets as well as activist groups. And the one which I wish to focus on is multigender. Now, this is something which I found on a page by Healthline, but it is also a quote-unquote gender identity that has been pushed by Mermaids, a UK-based charity which deals with trans kids and seems to have a lot of weight behind it. I don't believe that they would latch onto something like multigender, as ridiculous as it sounds, unless they believe that there was something truly real behind it. So according to Healthline, multigender is an umbrella term used to describe people who experience more than one gender identity, including bigender, trigender, pangender, and polygender. But what does any of this actually mean? What does this actually look like? Admittedly, this is quite hard to find. There aren't that many articles on something like multigender. It is quite obscure even within like the progressive intersectional movement. However, I was able to find a piece on it written in 2018 from a website called The Body Is Not an Apology. This is a blatantly progressive website, and this is somewhere which I think would actually put a little bit of weight behind what that identity means. This is going to be the kind of article which the author intends people to refer to if they're trying to find out more about it. Now, the article does mention that you can experience genders as full or independent, as partial or mixed. Genders can overlap and negate one another. They can be positive or negative, fixed or in flux, and they can coalesce in any number of combinations. So this Q&A article is effectively going to answer these questions, one would assume. So let's see the points that they raise. Number 1, that being multigender is not different from being transgender. Number 2, having a multigender identity is true to life. Number 3, multigender is fundamentally anti-gender binary. Number 4, multigender identities can include neutral, negative, or partial genders. Number 5, there is no limit to the number of genders someone can have. Number 6, you should respect their pronouns. Number 7, multigender identities can be static or fluid. Number 8, you could potentially appropriate somebody else's cultural gender if you identify partially as two-spirit. Number 9, multigendered people are oppressed. And number 10, there are plenty of multigender identities, including chaos gender, cold gender, endogender, cyclogender, cisgender, domgender, and gendervex. Now, they've raised 10 different points about what it means to be multigender. However, there is a very key point that they've actually missed out in all of this, and it shouldn't take you that long to figure it out, because you probably still have no idea what any of this means. And this is a real problem when you want people to respect particular identities. For example, I am a trans woman. I've transitioned from being a man to being a woman, and that involved a long process of meeting with various medical professionals. I did need to get a bit of counselling to do with it. I had to undergo medical procedures. And it is something which still does impact my life to this day. There is a grounding there which I can talk about. Now, if you identify as neither male or female, that argument is going to be potentially much harder to make because not many people are going to have that kind of understanding. But when it comes to something like multigender, we don't have a clue what that means. Now, if I was to be identifying as both male or female at the same time, I could imagine that would be a huge strain on you mentally. Certainly being a trans woman, that has a huge impact on the way in which you see yourself. And dealing with things such as gender dysphoria can be exhausting. In fact, until you get the correct healthcare to be able to deal with it, life can be incredibly difficult. But in what way is it really difficult for a multigender person? There isn't really much of an explanation except for more and more buzzwords. For example, they focus on how a multigendered person is oppressed. Now, this is something which the progressive community often like to home in on, that that everyone's dealing with levels of oppression, and this is where a lot of people effectively get their social credit from. But they mention things like femmephobia. That's not a term I've ever come across. I think a lot of people would use phrases like misogyny, because I think that's what they're kind of aiming for. But again, it's not clear. They're using a hell of a lot of different buzzwords. But all of this is only going to make sense if you come from a particular community. And that is the more progressive queer community. And that's particularly clear when they talk about appropriation, when they say that you can only really identify as a two-spirit person if you come from a North American indigenous group. When it comes to two-spirit, this is something which a lot of the gender arguments kind of fall down upon if you're trying to relate it to some sort of biological reality. Because in these instances, these genders can only be attained if you are from a particular culture. Now, a while ago, I spoke to a non-binary follower of mine. This is someone who was previously quite far left by their own admission, but walked away from it when they saw how extreme the lunacy got. Now, they are from Canada, and they actually have North American, indigenous ancestry within them. So by the kind of queer community's own logic, they would be able to identify as Two-Spirit if they wanted. But as they explained to me, they are not a part of that culture. They've never really known it. They might have that ancestry, but that doesn't mean that they have anything to do with it. And so it just seemed weird and kind of alien for them to do so, particularly as Two-Spirit isn't really described in the same way that a lot of these neo-genders are applied to people. And I think that the cultural argument for a lot of these is really where it lies. If you have a look at a list of non-binary people on Wikipedia, for example, you will see a lot of names in there. There were certainly over 100 from the last time that I checked. Now, a lot of these are various public figures. There are artists, there's drag queens, there are actors. But all of them have something in common. Now, if you can just hazard a guess, how many of them do you think espouse any sort of right-wing view? I mean, you don't really even need me to put a clock on the screen here, because you all know the answer is going to be 0, and that's absolutely right. I went through every single one that I could find just to see whether there was any real any kind of political leanings on there or anything which might signify that they are in no way associated with the queer community. And things either come back inconclusive, or you can blatantly see that they are leftists. It's obvious for people like Jim Sterling, who recently came out as non-binary, but has had a lot of experience within that community. And in fact, if you're a part of the queer community, or you've ever come into contact with it over a period of time, you will notice that as a group gets one non-binary person, more and more and more will start to sneak in. All of a sudden, people will realise, oh, I've been non-binary all along. Now, because the queer community doesn't believe in any sort of gatekeeping, because there is no border on gender identity, there isn't any requirement that people have gender dysphoria. Anyone and anything can identify as whatever they want. And they always will treat this as seriously as possible. If you say that you are something, that's it. That is their solid rule that they've always put in play. But as we've seen with Super Straight, that kind of rule where somebody identifies something and that's it, it's not questionable, that doesn't apply. Because they see, well, that kind of belief is bigoted. As I mentioned earlier, whether it's bigoted or not doesn't really come into play if we're talking about someone's sincere belief. And that's another argument that they'll often rely on, that somebody feels sincerely about it. But that's all well and good. People can feel as sincere as they want. And in fact, it's very hard to really figure out whether or not somebody is genuinely sincere. But does it really mean that it therefore is valid? Especially when you're looking at it as an outsider from these communities. It's very easy to see that a lot of this is more cultural, and this is ways that people who might identify as however they want kind of relate it to the people around them. They see someone who is a man but likes to put on a dress and therefore must be non-binary, and therefore think, well, I must be non-binary as well. Whereas outside of that community, that might have a different name, or it might not even be a thing at all. And so the question of validity really comes down to whether or not it is a part of your culture. Now, the left isn't going to be one to tell you that all cultures are valid, even if they try and make that argument. We all know that they hold particularly Western and American and British cultures in complete disdain. They very openly want to dismantle them. So they don't have any inherent respect for a culture if they don't like it. And the same is going to apply for everyone around the world. Not all cultures are going to be equal here. And so it also becomes a lot of an issue when we're dealing with the way in which these activists have infiltrated various organisations to push their ideology, to push their own beliefs and try and have it as an irrefutable fact, where if you misgender someone, regardless of how ridiculous their pronouns are, you can have anything from an online mob coming after you to losing your job. These are serious ramifications, and it isn't just a case of, what harm is it to just respect someone's pronouns, because there are more and more evidence of there being actual real-world repercussions. It isn't a simple case of just be nice, because if it was just be nice, you wouldn't be having people effectively in fear of not calling out this lunacy. I mean, if we go back to the Keenan Lonsdale articles, despite him using tree and tree self pronouns, you would notice quite quickly that not a single article refers to him in such a way. They clearly see it as ludicrous, but they're not going to openly show that because they're scared of their own mob. And this brings me to a key point about the validity of these various genders and identities. You would have absolutely no idea that anyone identifies in such a way unless they explicitly tell you that they do. You cannot tell that Keenan Lonsdale uses tree and tree self pronouns just by looking at him. You cannot tell that Sam Smith is a they just by looking at his appearance, because he does not give off that message. At least with trans men and trans women, our changes are very visible. And with gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals, you get a feel for their identity just by looking at their dating preferences, but not so with people who identify with trees or as multiple genders. They cannot even give you an ultimate description of what it is and what it means to be such a thing. We do not know what a multi-gendered transition looks like. We do not know what healthcare they need, what specific difficulties they have in their day-to-day life. They do not give us any of that information, and the only thing we have to go off is just by them saying it is valid. Unfortunately, that is simply not enough for your average person, and it never will be in the kind of society that we live in. And even within queer circles, based on the way in which people dance around a lot of these, and all they say is they're valid, and they don't really go into much more detail than that, I can almost guarantee you that take your average progressive activist off to the side, make sure that there's no big name queers listening in or anything like that, and they will tell you that all of this stuff is bullshit. But I do not believe that they believe it themselves. I know this from having multiple conversations from people within the queer community who may espouse bizarre rhetoric in front of other people, but take them to the side and they know how strange a lot of this is. Ultimately, if you want to respect somebody's pronouns, that's on you, but you cannot demand that the rest of society treat it as valid and real when this only exists within alternative cultures that, despite how hard they might try, they are not the cultural zeitgeist outside of their own bubbles. So anyway, I want to just thank everyone for sticking with me whilst I've been having this break from YouTube. I'm going to be uploading much more regular content at this point. I'm aiming for at least one video a week, if not more. I've really enjoyed having my break away, although I've enjoyed doing Seal of Approval as well. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. You can also follow me at Minds, Twitter, and on Twitch. And you can also support me on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thanks again, I'll see you all next time. And I want to give a special thanks to Alex Meadows, Aurora T. Silver, Carla Jackson, Grey Brother, James C. George, James UK, Jess, Kim Vandry, Lucy, the Talmenian, Rose Hypnol, Steve Hendricks, Zoe, in Literati, and basically everyone who has stuck with me during this time. I know that I've had a good few months away from the channel, and I just want to thank everyone for their continued support. There is going to be a lot more content coming out over the next couple of weeks. I am getting back to a more regular video production time, but I do really appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much.